It started as just another morning. Daniel Carter stretched as the sun filtered through his bedroom blinds, the scent of coffee drifting up from the kitchen where his wife, Linda, was already awake. As he pulled on a sweater and walked toward the window, he had no idea that everything had changed overnight. Then he saw it. His entire house had been repainted. And not just repainted, completely erased a personality. The deep navy blue exterior that he and Linda had carefully chosen 3 years ago, gone. The elegant white trim around the windows, vanished. In its place was the most soulless, monotonous beige he had ever seen. Daniel froze, his brain struggling to process what he was looking at. He grabbed his glasses, convinced it was just a trick of the light. It wasn't. His house had been repainted overnight. And when he rushed outside to get a better look, he saw that every house on the street had suffered the same fate. Confusion turns to chaos. Linda stepped outside moments later, her face still groggy from sleep. And then she screamed. "Oh my God, what happened to our house?" Across the street, Lisa Monroe, their neighbor, was already outside in her robe, arms crossed and face twisted in rage. "What the hell is going on?" Lisa snapped, looking at her now beige house in horror. This was gray yesterday. One by one, more doors flew open. Jim Dawson, the retired veteran, stormed onto his porch. Who the hell did this? The Sullivan family emerged, their teenage daughter nearly crying as she pointed at what used to be their bright yellow home, now a lifeless, muddy beige. "Mom, it looks awful." Within minutes, the entire neighborhood was outside. 50, maybe 60 people, all staring in disbelief at their violated homes. No one had agreed to this. No one had been warned. And the worst part, whoever did this had done it in the dead of night. Security camera footage unveils the shocking truth. Daniel, still trying to make sense of it all, pulled out his phone. "Check your security cameras," he said, already opening his own app. One by one, people scrambled to review their footage. And what they saw made their blood run cold. Between midnight and 4 a.m., a fleet of unmarked white trucks had rolled into the neighborhood. Teams of masked painters had flooded the streets, working methodically, efficiently, covering every house in uniform beige. Some of them had headlamps. Others used massive floodlights. The work was silent, eerily orchestrated, as if they had done this before. By the time the first hint of sunrise touched the rooftops, the trucks were gone. And in their wake, a neighborhood that had been stripped of its character, erased in the night. Confronting the lies began. The angry mob of homeowners marched straight to the HOA office, which was conveniently located in the pristine clubhouse at the entrance of the neighborhood. Cynthia Blake, the HOA president, was already waiting. She sat behind her massive oak desk, sipping a coffee like it was just another Tuesday. Daniel slammed a stack of security screenshots onto her desk. "What the hell is this?" Cynthia didn't even flinch. She set her coffee down, laced her fingers together, and gave the group a tight-lipped smile. This was a mandatory beautification project. The room erupted in protests. "Beautification? You call this ugly-ass beige beautiful?" Lisa shouted. Cynthia gave a fake, patient sigh. "This is a planned improvement for the community. The board voted on it 2 months ago." Daniel's jaw tightened. No one voted on this. No one even knew about this. Cynthia's smile never wavered. "Well, I'm afraid you must have missed the notices," she said smoothly. Jim slammed his cane against the floor. There were no damn notices. And then Cynthia delivered the final blow. "This project was already paid for through HOA funds," she said. "So if you'd like to repaint your house, you're welcome to do so, at your own expense." Daniel felt his blood boil. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a miscommunication. This was a scam, and he was going to prove it. Digging into the HOA's finances, the scheme uncovered. That night, Daniel met with Brian Sloan, a local attorney who had handled HOA fraud cases before. "I need you to look into something," Daniel said, handing Brian a thick folder. Inside were financial statements from the HOA, copies of the security footage, a list of board members who had approved the project. Brian flipped through the pages, nodding slowly. Then he stopped. His eyes narrowed. "Daniel," he said, tapping a company name listed on the contract for the painting job. "This painting company, the one the HOA hired for the beautification project, Daniel leaned forward. What about it? Brian's lips curled into a smirk. It's owned by Cynthia Blake. Daniel's stomach dropped. She paid herself for this job? Brian nodded. She didn't just force this on homeowners. She used HOA funds to funnel a massive payout into her own pocket. It was fraud. Plain and simple. And if they could prove it, Cynthia Blake was going down. Daniel Carter stared at the name on the contract, the realization sinking in like a stone in his gut. Cynthia Blake owned the painting company. It was fraud. She had hired herself, used HOA money, and forced the entire neighborhood into a massive, unwanted, overnight repainting scheme just to line her own pockets. And she thought she'd get away with it. But she had no idea what was coming. Because Daniel and the homeowners of Maple Ridge were about to fight back harder than she ever expected. The lawsuit begins, taking Cynthia to court. The morning after discovering the fraud, Daniel met with Brian Sloan, the attorney, and several furious homeowners at Lisa Monroe's house. Brian wasted no time. This is textbook embezzlement, he said, flipping through the financial records. Cynthia Blake committed fraud, misappropriation of funds, and a clear abuse of power. Lisa leaned forward. Can we sue her? Brian smirked. Not just her. Daniel raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? Brian tapped a list of HOA board members who had approved the repainting. If we're doing this, he said, we're taking down the entire corrupt HOA. Gathering evidence, the HOA's dark secrets unravel. Over the next 2 weeks, the homeowners worked with Brian to build the case. What they uncovered was bigger than just the repainting scam. Cynthia's company had been secretly receiving HOA contracts for years, everything from landscaping to security patrols. She had forged board member approvals for major projects. She had funneled over $650,000 from HOA dues into her own business accounts. She had silenced homeowners with illegal fines whenever they asked questions. And then the final piece of evidence dropped. Jim Dawson, the retired veteran, had a hidden camera on his front porch. It had captured something no one expected. The painters were instructed to repaint only the homes of outspoken HOA critics first. They had started with Daniel's house, Lisa's, Jim's. Anyone who had previously challenged Cynthia had been targeted first. This wasn't just a scam, Daniel muttered, watching the footage. This was revenge. Brian grinned. Perfect. That makes our case even stronger. Serving the lawsuit, Cynthia's world begins to crumble. 3 weeks later, at exactly 8 a.m., a court-appointed process server walked into the HOA office. Cynthia Blake was at her desk, drinking coffee and typing on her laptop, probably drafting another bogus violation notice. The server placed a thick envelope in front of her. Cynthia Blake. She looked up, bored. Yes, you've been served. Her smug expression vanished. What? For what? The server didn't answer. He just turned and walked away. Cynthia ripped open the envelope, and her hands started shaking as she read the lawsuit. Daniel, Lisa, Jim, and over 40 homeowners were suing her personally for fraud and embezzlement, illegal use of HOA funds, retaliation against residents, negligence in leadership, and worst of all, the lawsuit demanded a full forensic audit of all HOA finances over the last 6 years. If Cynthia thought she had problems before, she was about to learn what real trouble looked like. The HOA's panic. Board members began jumping ship. Within days of the lawsuit hitting Cynthia, the rest of the HOA board collapsed. The vice president, Eric Landers, resigned immediately, claiming he had no idea what was going on. The treasurer, Melissa Green, tried to delete files from the HOA office, but forgot about the cloud backups. 2 other board members lawyered up, terrified they'd get dragged down with Cynthia. And the final nail in the coffin. An anonymous whistleblower, one of the HOA's own employees, came forward with even more dirt. He provided emails proving Cynthia had been rigging HOA board elections for years, keeping herself in power through fake ballots and manipulated votes. When the local news got hold of the story, it exploded. And Cynthia's once unshakable control over Maple Ridge was crumbling faster than she could stop it. Cynthia's desperate attempt to save herself. With the trial approaching, Cynthia panicked. First, she tried to file a countersuit, claiming the homeowners were harassing her. The judge laughed it out of court. Then she held an emergency HOA meeting, trying to convince people the lawsuit would bankrupt the neighborhood. Lisa stood up mid-meeting and slapped a giant poster on the wall. It was a breakdown of the stolen funds, including the $120,000 Cynthia had spent on personal vacations using HOA money. "Tell me again," Lisa said, arms crossed, "how this was for the community." The homeowners erupted in fury. Cynthia stormed out of the meeting, her face red with rage. Because now, she had no one left to protect her. The courtroom battle, justice at last. The trial began 6 months later. By now, the lawsuit had grown into a full-scale legal assault. Brian stood before the judge, presenting undeniable proof that Cynthia had illegally used HOA funds to pay herself. She had orchestrated the overnight repainting as part of personal vendetta. She had manipulated board elections to keep herself in power. Then the final blow. The bank records, showing the money trail from HOA accounts directly into Cynthia's business and personal investments. The judge's gavel came down hard. The ruling: Cynthia was ordered to repay every stolen dollar, over $720,000. The HOA was dissolved immediately. All homeowners were given the right to repaint their homes at the HOA's expense. And Cynthia herself? She was personally found liable for fraud. She had one last chance to settle out of court. If she refused, she was looking at jail time. For most people, losing a lawsuit of this scale would be enough to send them into hiding. But not Cynthia Blake. No, Cynthia was delusional. And if she couldn't control Maple Ridge through the HOA, she was going to destroy it on her way out. Her final gamble was about to begin, and it would be her biggest mistake yet. The attempt to flee and the shock arrest. With $720,000 in court-ordered repayments looming over her, Cynthia realized the truth. She couldn't pay it back. Not without selling her house, liquidating assets, and giving up everything. And Cynthia Blake did not believe in losing. So she did what all desperate con artists do. She ran. Or at least she tried to. 1 week after the court ruling, Daniel was at the local coffee shop, finally enjoying the peace of a post-HOA world, when his phone buzzed. It was Lisa, and she was laughing so hard she could barely speak. "Turn on the news," she gasped. Daniel grabbed a remote behind the counter and flipped to the local station. And there she was, Cynthia Blake in handcuffs, being escorted off a private jet by federal agents. Daniel's jaw dropped. What the hell? The news anchor's voice was calm but amused. In a bizarre twist, former HOA President Cynthia Blake was arrested this morning while attempting to board a private jet to the Cayman Islands, allegedly attempting to flee the country following her legal defeat last week. Authorities say Blake attempted to use newly discovered offshore accounts to escape financial penalties. Lisa was wheezing. She actually thought she could get away. Jim Dawson, the retired veteran, had tears in his eyes from laughing. "I knew she was greedy," he said, shaking his head. "But I didn't know she was this dumb." And as the screen showed Cynthia being shoved into a black SUV, Daniel realized something. She had officially lost everything. The HOA's final days, and the last stand of Cynthia's followers. With Cynthia in federal custody, the remnants of the HOA board panicked. The few remaining members held an emergency meeting, desperately trying to salvage power. One of them, Eric Landers, the former vice president, stood in front of a half-empty conference room and begged homeowners to reconsider. "The HOA is not the problem," he pleaded. "Cynthia was the problem. If we restructure, we can—" He was cut off by Lisa. Lisa, who had waited years for this moment. She stood up and held a single piece of paper in the air. It was a petition. One that had already been signed by over 80% of the homeowners in Maple Ridge. A petition to dissolve the HOA permanently. "We don't want your HOA anymore, Eric." Lisa's voice was firm. "And legally, we don't have to keep it." The remaining board members looked at each other in horror. The decision was final. The HOA of Maple Ridge was officially dead. The aftermath: what happened to Cynthia? After several weeks in federal custody, Cynthia finally had her day in court. This time, she wasn't facing homeowners. She was facing the federal government. The charges were serious. Wire fraud, attempting to move stolen funds overseas. Tax evasion, failing to disclose her offshore accounts. Violation of court orders, attempting to flee. The judge did not go easy on her. Ms. Blake, he said, shaking his head, you had every opportunity to accept responsibility for your actions. Instead, you attempted to flee justice. Then came the final ruling. 10 years in federal prison, with no chance of early release. And that was the end of Cynthia Blake. Meanwhile, in Maple Ridge, with the HOA officially gone, homeowners took full control of their neighborhood. The first community meeting was held, where residents, not a corrupt board, made decisions together. The first street renovation project was voted on and completed at half the cost of what the HOA had previously charged. The first HOA-free Halloween event took place, with no ridiculous noise restrictions, no absurd rules, and more participation than ever before. For the first time in over a decade, Maple Ridge was a place where people actually wanted to live. And as Daniel walked down the street one evening, he saw something that made him smile. A painter's truck. One by one, houses were being repainted, but this time, in colors the owners actually chose. Bright blues, warm reds, vibrant greens. The personality was coming back, and Cynthia's beige nightmare was finally disappearing for good. The final toast to a life without tyranny. 1 year after the HOA officially dissolved, the homeowners of Maple Ridge held a final celebration. No more HOA fees. No more bogus fines. No more power-hungry dictators. Lisa raised her drink. To our first full year of freedom. Jim smirked. And to Cynthia rotting in prison. Daniel grinned. To never living under an HOA again. Glasses clinked. And as the homeowners laughed, talked, and celebrated, one thing was clear. Maple Ridge had won. And no one was ever going to take it from them again. For the first time in over a decade, the neighborhood of Maple Ridge was finally free. No HOA control. No bogus fines. No power-hungry board dictating every little rule. And yet, as much as the homeowners celebrated their victory, a new question lingered in the air. Now what? The HOA was gone. But could the community really function without it? Or would Maple Ridge fall apart without someone in charge? The next few months would answer that question once and for all. The first town hall meeting, a new beginning. 3 weeks after the HOA's dissolution, Daniel, Lisa, and a handful of other homeowners gathered in the community center for something new. A neighborhood-wide town hall meeting. Not a mandatory HOA meeting. Not a place for fines, threats, or scolding. But a true discussion about how they wanted to run their neighborhood together. As people filed in, Lisa leaned over to Daniel. This is either going to be brilliant, she whispered, or a complete disaster. Daniel smirked. Either way, at least no one's getting fined for wearing the wrong shade of beige. That alone was a step in the right direction. The three main concerns. What happens without an HOA? As the meeting began, three main concerns emerged from the homeowners. Who handles maintenance? Without an HOA, how would they fund and manage community repairs, like street lights or the neighborhood park? How do we handle security? Would crime rise now that there were no HOA security patrols, which in reality were just Cynthia's hired cronies? Will property values drop? Without strict HOA rules, would people stop maintaining their homes and drag down everyone's property values? The group talked, debated, argued, and then they started coming up with real solutions. 1. The community fund, a smarter alternative to HOA fees. Instead of forcing residents to pay high HOA fees, the homeowners agreed to set up a voluntary community fund. Instead of $350 per month, what the HOA used to charge, homeowners would only contribute if they wanted to. Money would go directly into a transparent fund, managed by a local accountant, not a corrupt board. Homeowners would vote on how to spend the money, whether it was fixing sidewalks, upgrading playgrounds, or improving lighting. Within 2 months, the community had raised more money than the HOA ever did because people actually trusted where it was going. And best of all, the community was saving thousands by hiring real, honest contractors, not Cynthia's overpriced connections. 2. A neighborhood watch, real security without the HOA's lies. Before, the HOA had used security patrols as an excuse to harass homeowners. Now, they needed real security. Jim Dawson, the retired veteran, stepped up. I'll organize a neighborhood watch, he offered. And not the fake kind Cynthia used to run. Under Jim's leadership, they installed motion-activated streetlights and ring cameras in key areas. established a direct line with local police for emergencies, formed a volunteer patrol to walk the neighborhood at night, not to find people, but to keep them safe. Within 6 months, crime in Maple Ridge dropped by 40%, proving that a community watching out for each other worked far better than an HOA ever did. 3. Home aesthetics. Will property values crash? One of the biggest HOA fears had always been, if we don't control everything, people will let their homes fall apart and drag down the whole neighborhood. That didn't happen. At first, some homeowners were nervous. Would their neighbors start painting their houses neon green? Would they stop mowing their lawns just to spite the old HOA? But the exact opposite happened. Homeowners took pride in their properties, without fear of petty fines. People repainted their homes, not beige, but colors they actually loved. Yards became more unique, some added gardens, others put up handmade decorations that would have been banned before. And when a real estate report came in 6 months later, Maple Ridge's home values had increased by 15%, all because people were free to actually make their homes their own. They owe a free festival, a celebration of their victory. 1 year after the HOA collapsed, Lisa had an idea. We should throw a festival, she said, grinning. At what? Daniel raised an eyebrow. A festival. A HOA-free celebration. Something fun, something that brings everyone together. A year ago, an event like this would have never been allowed. The HOA would have shut it down for noise complaints. Now, the entire neighborhood came together to make it happen. A barbecue competition in the park. Music and games for the kids. A bonfire at the end of the night where they symbolically burned an old HOA violation letter. Jim Dawson laughed as the flames consumed the paper. Never thought I'd see the day, he muttered. A real community without an HOA. Lisa smirked. And we did it all on our own. A final surprise, Cynthia's letter from prison. 2 months later, Daniel received a letter. The return address. A federal prison. Lisa grabbed it. No way. Daniel opened it carefully, reading the messy handwriting inside. Daniel, I hope you know you've ruined a perfectly good community. You and your little group have no idea what you're doing. Without real leadership, Maple Ridge will collapse into chaos and failure. I hope you enjoy watching your neighborhood fall apart. I'll be out of here eventually. And when I am, I'll be watching. Sincerely, Cynthia Blake. Lisa burst out laughing. She still thinks she was the good guy? Jim smirked. I think prison broke her. Daniel took the letter, grabbed a lighter, and set it on fire. As the flames burned through Cynthia's last pathetic attempt to hold power, Daniel grinned. Maple Ridge wasn't falling apart. It was stronger than ever. And Cynthia Blake, she was just a bad memory. Months had passed since Cynthia Blake had been sentenced to 10 years in federal prison for her crimes against the residents of Maple Ridge. The neighborhood had moved on and was thriving in ways it never had before. But Cynthia's obsession with power hadn't ended behind bars. Even from prison, she was planning a final desperate attempt to reclaim control over the very community she had destroyed. The shocking lawsuit, Cynthia tries to strike back. One afternoon, as Daniel Carter sat enjoying a quiet cup of coffee on his front porch, he saw a certified letter being delivered. He flipped it over, recognizing the return address. Federal Correctional Institution, Cynthia Blake. Lisa joined him, peering over his shoulder. Oh, what does that lunatic want now? Daniel ripped the envelope open and began to read. His eyes narrowed as he scanned a legal document inside. She's suing us, he said flatly. Lisa's eyes widened. What? Daniel set the letter on the table. She's claiming that we defamed her character by publicly exposing her crimes. She's demanding financial compensation for emotional distress. Lisa laughed so hard she nearly fell over. She thinks she has a reputation left to ruin? She's in prison for God's sake. Jim Dawson wandered over, sipping a beer. She's probably just desperate for money. How's she going to pay for lawyers? Daniel flipped to the last page of the lawsuit, frowning. It says here she's being represented by her cousin, an attorney who's doing this pro bono. Lisa snorted. Desperation runs in the family, I guess. Community unites, a new legal team forms. Daniel and Lisa wasted no time rallying the neighborhood. They called a meeting at the community center, inviting Brian Sloan, the attorney who had helped them take down the HOA. Brian stood before a crowd of concerned homeowners. Cynthia's lawsuit is a desperate attempt to intimidate you from behind bars, he explained. But it has no real merit. She's hoping you'll be too scared or exhausted to fight back. Jim crossed his arms. I'm not scared of that woman, even if she's a ghost haunting us from prison. Brian smirked. Good, because we're going to file a countersuit for malicious prosecution. She's trying to weaponize the legal system to bully this community, and we're going to make her regret it. A cheer erupted from the crowd. The residents of Maple Ridge were done playing defense. It was time to end Cynthia's influence once and for all. The legal battle begins, round 2. The courtroom was packed as the new trial began. Cynthia was present via video link, looking gaunt and angry in her prison uniform. Her cousin, the pro bono attorney, argued that Cynthia had suffered irreparable harm to her reputation and deserved financial restitution. But Brian was ready. Your Honor, he said calmly, Cynthia Blake is a convicted felon who embezzled over $720,000 from this community. She has no reputation left to damage. In fact, her lawsuit is an attempt to manipulate the legal system out of spite and revenge. He presented testimony from residents describing Cynthia's harassment and financial abuse, records of her fraudulent activities that led to her conviction, evidence of her ongoing attempts to threaten the neighborhood even after her sentencing. Cynthia's expression twisted with rage as Brian laid out her pattern of manipulation and abuse. And when the judge finally spoke, his words were unforgiving. Ms. Blake, it is clear that your lawsuit is an abuse of the legal process, he said. This court finds in favor of the residents of Maple Ridge, and your lawsuit is hereby dismissed. Then he dropped the final hammer. Furthermore, you are ordered to pay $50,000 in punitive damages to the community you have terrorized. Cynthia's jaw dropped. But I'm in prison. I can't pay that. The judge's expression was cold. That is not the community's problem. The aftermath, Cynthia's reign, finally ends. Back in Maple Ridge, there was a joyful celebration. They had stood up to Cynthia one final time and won. Lisa raised a glass during the gathering. To Maple Ridge, a place where no one person will ever have too much power again. Jim chuckled. And to Cynthia, who's hopefully crying in her prison cell right about now. But even as they laughed, they knew this victory was about more than just one corrupt woman. It was about reclaiming their right to live without fear, without manipulation, and without the constant presence of someone who thought they were above everyone else. Maple Ridge was finally free, and this time it was for good. A final twist, the mysterious buyer. Months later, as Daniel was taking a walk around the neighborhood, he noticed a for sale sign on Cynthia's old house. The once pristine lawn was overgrown, the paint peeling. No one had maintained it since Cynthia's arrest. The house was purchased almost immediately. But when Daniel asked the real estate agent about the buyer, the response surprised him. They bought it under a trust name, New Beginnings LLC. They said they want to turn it into something positive for the community. Lisa's eyes lit up when Daniel told her the news. What if we turned Cynthia's house into a community center? The neighborhood rallied behind the idea. Over the course of 6 months, they transformed the property into a place where residents could gather, hold events, and make decisions about their community, together. In the very house where Cynthia once ruled with fear, the people of Maple Ridge built a symbol of hope and unity. It was a fitting end to the long, dark chapter Cynthia had written. And as the community center doors opened for the first time, Daniel whispered, "This is what true community looks like." Because the real victory wasn't just beating Cynthia in court. It was creating a place where everyone had a voice. And that was something no one could ever take away. It had been 2 years since Cynthia Blake had been sentenced to 10 years in prison, and her fraudulent HOA was permanently dissolved. And yet, for the homeowners of Maple Ridge, life had never been better. No harassment, no bogus fines, no HOA dictatorship. The community had taken back control of their own neighborhood, and what happened next was something that no one, not even the most die-hard HOA supporters, could have predicted. Maple Ridge was about to become a national success story. The HOA-free experiment, a model for other communities. After the lawsuit and the scandal, many outsiders had expected Maple Ridge to fall apart without the strict oversight of an HOA. But the exact opposite happened. Property values skyrocketed. Despite the HOA's past fear-mongering, Homes in Maple Ridge appreciated at a higher rate than neighboring HOA-controlled communities. Crime rates dropped. Thanks to the community-led security program, Maple Ridge had one of the lowest crime rates in the county. The community became more united than ever. Without an HOA board dictating everything, people actually worked together to make decisions that benefited everyone. Word about their success story spread beyond their town. Local news stations ran stories titled, "The HOA That Destroyed Itself," and how a community rebuilt without it. No HOA? No problem. How one neighborhood proved the experts wrong. HOA tyranny versus true community. The stunning experiment that worked. And then, other communities took notice. A national movement. More communities fight back. Daniel started receiving emails and calls from homeowners across the country. How did you do it? Our HOA is corrupt too. How can we get rid of it? Can you help us fight back? It wasn't just Maple Ridge that had been suffering. HOAs across the country had been pushing ridiculous restrictions, like banning Christmas decorations or forbidding American flags. Some had been caught embezzling from homeowners, just like Cynthia had. Others were abusing their power to control what people could and couldn't do with their own properties. Maple Ridge became a symbol, proof that life without an HOA wasn't just possible, it was better. Lisa joked, "We should write How to Take Down Your handbook." Jim grinned, "Or start a consulting firm." They were half joking, but the idea had merit. Because now, Maple Ridge had something invaluable. Experience. They knew exactly how to dismantle a corrupt HOA, and they were more than willing to help others do the same. Turning Cynthia's house into a community hub. One of the most symbolic moments in Maple Ridge's transformation was what they did with Cynthia's old house. After her conviction, the government seized her assets, including her mansion, which had once served as the unofficial HOA headquarters. For months, the house sat abandoned, a reminder of her reign of terror. Then, the residents had an idea. What if, Daniel suggested, we turn it into a community center? And that's exactly what they did. The house was renovated into a meeting space where residents could gather to discuss neighborhood projects, a free-lending library and kids' play area, a community garden where people could grow and share fresh produce. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Cynthia had spent years controlling people from that house. Now, it was a place where everyone had a voice. The first free election, democracy at work. To ensure that no single person could ever hold too much power again, the community established a democratic voting system for major decisions. Every homeowner had a vote. No board members with secret meetings. No backroom deals. No corruption. When an issue arose, like funding a new park bench or upgrading streetlights, the whole neighborhood voted. And because people actually trusted the system, participation rates were higher than they had ever been under the HOA. Cynthia used to say, "Without the HOA, this neighborhood will collapse." No, it was thriving in ways she could never have imagined. The final chapter, what became of Cynthia Blake? One day, Lisa got a call from an old friend who worked in prison administration. "You won't believe this," the friend said, laughing. "Cynthia is trying to start in prison." Lisa nearly dropped her phone. "You're joking." "Not at all," the friend chuckled. "She's trying to organize a prison block cleanliness initiative and fine inmates for leaving their bunk areas messy." Lisa wheezed. Some people never change. Cynthia's attempts to control the prison environment were quickly shut down by the guards. She spent the rest of her sentence alone, bitter and powerless. And when she was finally released early on parole after serving 6 years due to good behavior, she found herself completely broke and publicly humiliated. She tried to move to another state, but her infamous reputation followed her. No one wanted to hire her. No one wanted to rent to her. No one wanted anything to do with her. The former queen of Maple Ridge had become nothing more than a disgraced relic of past. And in the end, she had done it to herself. A neighborhood reborn, the legacy of Maple Ridge. 2 years after Cynthia's downfall, Maple Ridge wasn't just surviving without an HOA, it was thriving. It was more beautiful, more united, and more successful than ever before. More families wanted to move in. It became one of the most desirable non-HOA communities in the region. More local businesses thrived, without the HOA banning signs or limiting storefronts. More community events were held, celebrating everything from holidays to neighborhood milestones. And most importantly, People were happier. No one had to live in fear of an HOA fine. No one had to worry about hidden corruption. Maple Ridge was proof that a true community wasn't built on control and power. It was built on trust and collaboration. And as Daniel stood in front of the former HOA office, now public park, he smiled. They had won, and nothing, not even the ghost of Cynthia Blake, could ever take that away.